Tony Mong Chimbong Agata Pakartanang Santu Shima Do Tomba Tuji Chala Guchan Shotu Jira Kunki Kiko Watan Supisanji Pamaki Japri Shenor Sovande Taki Tongun Jabra Shenji Lo Tosundumari Chinda Kekin Ken Nyasome Honjura Gilas Semjen Don Tonyer To Tona Tamba Namji Num To Zato Oh yeah, that any so Terang Kapso the Katon Lojung Shirtang Shani, no Cap Dinani Lojung Tatum Dunyo Binani, Shirtang King and Lamcher de Mar Shani, no Kavo Chilla Level, Ni Katon Dinani, Katon Keran Tola Gia de Shirtang Kamato. She no chit tam chet dungum tandala hajam gatani tukcha topo tupo dong jewa ji maim ba tam chet zpo da wo ji chak ni ji den ji kam da la de dungan ma bo dong gang ma bo ji chai ji mi kam da la ne de nga chu lo jong she ya ka kor ka bi bo ji yo re de lo jong she tam kan nam ki ndi kor ka pe tam zum shi Yako chik pesho tani ne, sosu nimari rina to, kantab to chik shina ne, teni rong la panba tang jan la pantok yo pa chik chakare, te manna ne, teni tansang ka, nyongran di ji sun rang ni, sona ne, ta muntat tam che kangat li, tarya me pa chik, teni shong kyo re. Ti gyam zang ki, nga zu, terang ka kapso, ti kingan lam chik ka koron maap shat ni rong kyo re.
So, over the course of this weekend, we've been exploring these mind training teachings, as most of you here are aware. And we've been looking at what are called the 7 key points of mind training, with an emphasis on carrying adversity onto the path. And as I mentioned earlier, then when we find ourselves in this degenerate age, in which the outer universe, as the container environment in which we live, and its contents, us as sentient beings, are in a time of great turmoil and imbalance and a lack of peace internally, externally. And so we're in a kind of a rough period of time in the world. And for those of you who are mind trainers and have the tools for transforming adversity, for carrying suffering onto the path, this is an excellent opportunity for you. This is a time full of opportunities to practice. And so for someone training and taming, working on their mind, there's ample opportunities to do so. And so when we make that commitment, then we have a kind of a purpose in the midst of all that is going on that will be of benefit not only to ourselves, but that will be of benefit to others. And if we don't learn to work with and transform the hardships that we're facing, then we can expect that those troubles, if we just kind of follow after them and sort of immerse ourselves in and engage in them in the ordinary ways, that there will be no end to our hardships. And so today we are going to continue this teaching on transforming adversity, on carrying unwanted circumstances onto the path. So?
데레더니 다 나주 람도 캐리아게 강레제나네 깽은 담쳤대 되는 공도 주만 딱 봐나오신 러너소수 니마리리 넣고 최소제리라 대니 정때 지금 때마치 깔마리리 넣어라요 있는 루도 셈다 대니 셈기나나 유모 봐도 대셈 주파 나마 나속바 지 요리 멤버히요 봐나오신 치코히요 봐나오신 그 다나 유모 봐마고 투히요래 대견은 마보요래 시루 그게 다 차창데 이게 남바 대덕 탐쳤대 가레레제나네 나투 람도 케르샤데 드니 테케요래 정말 람도 케르샤데 가레고 그요래제나네 람도 케르샤데 냠렌데 가정 공도 괜히 무시니까니 괜히 니비니까나 삽접 니비니까나 샤파 나오셨죠. 니비니까 샤파죠. 건접 셈께 땅 돈덤 셈께니까라 땐니 타냥 람도 케르고 케르셰티 디케르요레스 대니 절대 케르비 춘대가르에 제나네 딱 건접 샤처고 셈께라 땐니 조장나 미니네 가정 공도 샤파 신도네 논바다 몰람담 담착선 문제 니슨 기고니 마주 셈나라 섬카르나 예후 가테 카르 마탑나는 디나니 왜는 논바다 몰람점 셈chen 탐체 둥을 때리 둥을 때다 때리 타르버 교식 삼야다 타소나 제마로 삼야다고 가롱 집시나요 대 득히요레 라나 섬드로나 예포요레 담찬도 말에 더니 몰름당 돈바당 몰름당 담착섬 도나 있고 요레스 더 카상이 그냥 조금 더 주인 더니 녀지 친구고니 데이터도 제야 되대 디르문 데라 카상이 그냥 돌아 지와데 가레세나는 강아탕 욕다 강이나 데라 머가베 득히 포한테 담보스 담보 조파이고 지금 라가 셈도 체로도 그 영어로 개체를 되지 당나 되니 딱견을 남도 결탑해요래니 되니 건좀 샹침 셈결라 되니 냠는 핏 녀지 축잠지 곰탐나 같이 탑해요나 까차 까마 카히 까차제거와 까차 카히라 곰탑해요나 되니 텔라 적니네 되니 영테타고 셈티 둥어티 모오데 셈 둥어 비랑 비찬지 모오가 남토고 모오 셈 코랑고 모오라 따하제 오야 때 하장도 나치 보지 김버 가수 실록라다야 마토고만 셈그 파다야 마토 셈 솔라다야 때 자님이 가수 셰키요만 디브셔나는 때니 둥어 용큰 그셈 용후 용큰 그셈 오야 디더니 랑시 당디 랑신라 츠르타세 때 तानी कांडे दो रावोची कांडे रावोची दो ताना कांडे दो फोरम कनोमिशन ता फोरम मो कांडे दो उस क्वेना नाचु मचिला फाताना ओ दी मन दडी दावरे जुपो दडी रे देनी शिकम दडी दावरे काचा चाता दडी रे सामयाची दोआ दे नोजे तनी छतानी सेम फोरम कनोमिशन कांडे ची दो उस क्वेना नाचु खापशिलो लागोनी दुंगर ता दुंगर पिजो ओ दुंगर दडी दावरे नादे गाखमदो 둥을 빈진들이라고 가르쳐도 삼니 갑시로 라고니 나좀 체크와 대나오진 둥을 용큰 그셈 코랑가 둥을 용큰 그셈 코랑 가리라고 그래 어 대직다 잠시니 띵어나 비적그레스 띵어나 따 잠시니 비적점 시니 노아테 하장 그 잠모지 어 드니 그 드니 대를 박선 그거니 절대 람도 케르츠르테 데이터고 보니 오요레스 어때서
你苦人卡上忙是谁呢？这个对，
Yeah, yeah.
马上。So what is it that we are looking here at this third key point of mind training? It's adverse conditions, which means circumstances or conditions that we dislike, are unhappy about. Those are what are being carried onto the path. And that's something that we want to be aware of throughout the day on a daily basis. In fact, ideally on an hourly basis. In fact, we could even do that on the basis of every minute. Then looking at the state of our body and our speech and our mind. And when adversity is arising, then internally, when we have something unwanted or that we are unhappy about, dislike, then our mind is disturbed, has all kinds of disruptive thoughts that are arising and disturbing us, kind of like boiling water or a blazing fire. And then externally, there's the condition that we look at and perceive as being something that we dislike and so forth. And so all of that is what we're calling adversity. The internal reaction, the external circumstance, that's what's being carried onto the path. So that's what adversity it is. And it is what we are carrying onto the path. Then in terms of the agent, what is it that carries it onto the path? What is the agent here? The agent is the practice, which we spoke about to some extent yesterday, which is the second key point of mind training, the main practice. And that is the practice of cultivating relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta, as was defined. So that's the agent, meaning that's our tool. That's what we use to carry that object, the adversity, onto the path. And then how do we carry that adversity onto the path? Then using that agent, we do so by applying relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. And as I mentioned, then the very first step is simply being aware of the adversity and acknowledging or recognizing the mental affliction in our mind as we relate to it. So it's recognizing what is taking place in our mind. Then we have 3 stages of practice. And so as we spoke about yesterday, the first of that is once we've recognized, okay, this is this and this mental affliction or negative thought that's taking place, then the first step of practice is to relinquish our perception that categorically dislikes whatever issue it is that we are seeing or perceiving, whatever problem it is that we perceive, the dislike, the unhappiness about it. And to focus on the mindset of thinking, I can be okay, which is the patient forbearance. I can be okay. And really then, by cultivating patient forbearance, what we're doing is we're expanding our mind's capacity to be okay on a greater basis. Because if we continue to focus on how we dislike things, then we're always going to have things that we dislike endlessly, and we just reinforce that habit, and therefore it perpetuates itself. And so then the first means for carrying adversity onto the path is recognizing that we actually have the capacity to not be disturbed and think I can be okay, and thus relinquish the focus, the reification on dislike. Then the second stage of practice is cultivating great compassion, as we spoke about yesterday. And so we cultivate that compassion of acknowledging all beings suffering in these ways, whatever the circumstance is, and we do that through 3 stages, which is, and this great compassion is what is referred to as relative bodhicitta. And so we cultivate a compassionate intention, then we cultivate compassionate aspirations, and then we cultivate compassion and a commitment. So the intention is like the wish of thinking, I wish or I want all beings to be free from such and such suffering, whatever it is you can call it. Then the second is in the aspiration, may all beings be free from this and this circumstance. And then if you're able, sometimes you just stop at the intention and the aspiration, but ideally we deepen that with a resolve in which we think and we commit ourselves. I commit myself, I vow to free all beings from such and such suffering. And in this we cultivate great compassion, as we spoke about yesterday, and of course there's contemplative processes to do so, but that's the overview. So that's the second step. So first, stop hating the suffering, stop the dislike. Second, turn your attention toward compassion through those 3 aspects. And then third is after you generate the compassionate practice, then you can just let your mind drop for a moment or 2 in kind of immerse in that. And then the final stage, the third step of practice, is the ultimate bodhicitta, is the profound wisdom aspect. And at that point, then, whatever your mind is experiencing at that moment, for example, if it's suffering still, then you look at the essence, the mind, instead of focusing on and objectifying the object or the reason why it's upset. Rather, you drop thinking about the reason of it and simply turn the mind toward itself and look at the essence of the suffering. Whatever, if you have a discursive thought or emotion, you look at the essence of that emotion. There's a great key point here that this will bring, which means you have to stop justifying why you're upset, let go of the reason, and just simply turn toward the emotion itself, the mental state itself, the suffering itself. And that's the opposite of what we normally do. Normally our mind is outwardly turned, so it's focused externally on other, and that's, how it gets upset. But now, instead of focusing on other, we turn toward itself. And it looks at its own essence. It looks at its own nature. What is it like? How is it? Where is it? Like that. Kind of like, it's the opposite. Normally we're looking at other things and people and we're judging them. We're thinking like, oh, we meet a person and then we're looking toward them and we think, oh, they look like this and their personality is like this and they, speak like this and so on. Instead, then we drop all of that external analysis and we look at the mind, the experiencer itself. What is its nature? What is it like? Look at its essence. So the looker is wisdom. And that's the profound insight. That's what sees or realizes true nature. And so that's what we call absolute bodhicitta. And so it's not the full ultimate bodhicitta by definition yet, but it's like the road, it's like a doorway toward that. It's going to lead us toward that. And so it eventuates in deeper and deeper and more profound insights. And then as soon as whatever it is we experience, when mind looks towards itself and in its own essence, at that moment, whatever is arising, then at that time, then we simply drop, we let go, and just let the mind rest for a few moments. So you merely look at its essence, merely rest. And that is very profound and deepens in profundity and insight over time. So that was the practice in a nutshell that we spoke about yesterday extensively, and we have those 3 stages of the not hating, cultivating compassion, and then cultivating profound wisdom in that moment. Also?
다 되니 가서 그 저와 가기 동제니 tani wetchet kahiyo. Te kanyin zenane, okay, ta nyumu batang, du tong semki kangar tang nyukta dungar kanyin na lam tu kerya tokhenduk di rimba tondom semki kunzub semki la teni. Yinna yang tani ta dewa chik shungna tengo tani tangpo o tani dewa la mergawi dukhi tani gawi dukhi ze marwa. Ra te gunla yang te che mergawi dukhi ga tango te la mergawa tangna te chik fungu duwe zena o tani te mixer ga cho mergawi dukhi fungu go mare ta won chang tani dewa lam kir shekure tani tamnyum lam kir yang shekure dewa tang dumar kain man pi sorwa tamnyum yang lam kir she na pe lo yakpore te nga chu semna la tangure tu takto piken namba chawa lam kir mare di ogla lo chung korang kal habsha kana la songore nipo kang shu zot par sha ze chigore te zena kare ze zena ta dungar piken namba la zot par sha ze chikte nyamlen la te ni ke namba lam chip shibi thokni zot par sha ji pa te chikte ni pa te dungar ze ma dewa ze dewa kang shu zot par sha kore kare jina dewa kare shini zot par che go du zena cham chamla nga chu devi ji sum dani ta mergewa na chapa bar fiore parche dewa ko dungar ni kala ti ti kangar sona ti gaya na yore cham cham ma mampu semna la khakita dungar sona nyumo pa mampu bar fiore te onchang mampu la teni dungar sona ne nyumo pa ha li pa kan draman bi nyumo pa tunga tuksum member par cheko ko mampu medni ti ti kare tina dungar ke nyumo pi zir chum ni wal chum lo yore Marta, teni dungar ke ore dungar ki yopi kopki yumo bape na kontrol do chik la so pa tham che chum lo ya ma bo yo tok ngari ke la so pa ka jina dungar ke top ke mo humble chek do do ba te ngari ke yo na chum do do ba te na chen teni dungar ku shona yumo pa tham chen jom ma jam do ke ko ra nyam ne ma chi na jam do ke yenna ya dewa ke na tan do chek ye tang kontrol ngari ke thang tok Kari yina yungyo. Ti wang to shorni lob jong nyam ro yin kai. Ti wang to khorni nyumo pa ke wo yin kai. Ti chena dewa tiang lam chi she ko do se. Ni po kang song zo par sha ji bir chik te dewa se khyo te chik res.
So there were some questions yesterday which tie into a few additional points that I wanted to add to the teachings thus far. And so then we emphasized the carrying of adversity onto the path yesterday when hardships occur and we're facing challenges. And the primary practice, the principal method amongst many that are presented here, is these 3 stages of practice, which essentially are the training in the main practice of relative and ultimate bodhicitta. But then the question is, what about other circumstances, like times where we like something and we're enjoying something, happiness, or what about in neutral circumstances? And certainly the mind training is intended to be practiced under all circumstances. It's just that we were focusing on the one section for adversity yesterday, since it's something that is particularly sort of predominant these days. But of course, we're going to have many other circumstances, and the truth is that the more that we practice under all circumstances, the stronger and more effective our practice is going to be. And so, for example, one example of this in the text is under the section of advice. It says, no matter, practice patience no matter which of the 2 occur. And I'm sure that's not the translation in the book, but you'll know because it says no matter which of the 2 occur. Be patiently forbearant, I think, maybe. And what that means, patience, not becoming disturbed. And so what that means is don't become disturbed under whichever of the 2 circumstances you encounter. The one circumstance is adversity, and the other circumstance is happiness. So, on the one hand, that we don't become disturbed, we have patience in the face of adversity, and we have the practices for doing that. And then on the other hand, the second is happiness. Because sometimes what happens when we have a lot of well-being or positive circumstances and success, then is that actually in relation to that, we get attached to that. We begin to fixate on that, and then we have all kinds of disturbing emotions. And then we engage in all kinds of negative actions. So we basically lose it in the face of success. And so that's not uncommon, especially the more success, the more danger of that happening occurs, where then our mental afflictions just completely take over, and then we are engaging in all kinds of actions that are harming others. And that's in relation to our good fortune. And so then human beings are so weird. Why? Because we don't want to suffer, and that's not okay. But then if we get too much happiness, we're not okay either. We can't handle it. Because then we have all kinds of problems, and we make all kinds of problems because we get too over sort of inflated and elated over those circumstances, and then we lose it too. So definitely we want to learn how to practice during that time as well. And so, in fact, sometimes we act worse in our successes than we do in our suffering. Because suffering can actually be humbling. Sometimes when we have a lot of loss or challenges and stuff like that, what happens is our jealousy, our pride, and all of these other, and then also the extent of our aversions and so forth, are kind of humbled in our own personal suffering. So it can actually gentle and humble us and decrease the amount of our afflictions. So sometimes suffering actually, even without practice, will sort of decrease some of our flaws, just naturally. Whereas happiness, that doesn't typically happen. So what happens is that if we have too much good fortune, we get too over-elated, and then we start to have pride, and we start to have more desire, and we start to have lots of jealousy, and then we start to have aversion, which is an anger around it. Like if you look at like people who have met a certain amount of wealth, there's a certain kind of point where they have a huge amount of wealth, and we think, oh, the more wealth you have, the more happy you're going to be. But there's a point where that's not the case, where it becomes something else. And so then there's the suffering of the state of wealth that comes with a certain amount of wealth that has a suffering. They have their own state of suffering.
Rich people have their own state have suffering.
Yes.
And the poor people have their own state have suffering.
So really the suffering might be very it looks different, but it's actually the same amount. Because the principal factor is the joy and well-being of mind, and it doesn't come from external circumstances. So those aren't the determining factor. And so then we lose it to positive circumstances. We have all kinds of mental afflictions. We create all kinds of harm for others, and then we have more problems. So then that is why the kind of additional advice to enhance the practice and to remember is no matter which of the two occurs, be patiently forbearant. That's all.
Yang de Tokyo Garresena when Nangato Deva Katu Shona, the Tolok Mata, Deng Teni Koran, Deva Shona, the Bishop Donine, the Deva della Penny, Young Gavata Tokyo, Lobshon Shake, Yuntan Sak, Della Ten, Gande Tokyo is another, Jan Semchin, Deva American Descension, some to make up the Mambo Yorba. Then he take that was Semchin Tam Chete, then in this Dawu Devata. The happy Deva dance on a Jemao, number Churchick, Samiachek. The Katok Padua. Or a day Tomachik, Sem Karna, Cheron Deva Yo Pateo, dated Yo Pateo. when I Nimarella Nato Kalaza, the Deki Pochionanda. Oh, yeah, and you did Pochikus only Namu Bay, Jepoda, the one from Tamanato. Oh, yeah, date some in Nanda. Oh, yeah, Natu, the Namu, the Poku, the Shiona Bay, walk or Yuton Kaka. She goes to the star, go to Jack or Pa, Yuton, and I was Kaka Chehio. You know, Sanchina, Nikumao, and you have the Dosho Chehio. So then he got whatever. There were no Chikunai, down Chimbo, Kari, Yonayam, then he sentient Hamchet, then he does that with Deva, the happy decade on dance on a Chimano, Damakuchi. Something, same canala, Tipshe, little Zokore, Hakosoma. Wrong lamsa, very cheap shit down our mind. Same canala, Tipshe, little Zoko. Okay, the Domba, Mumba, you keep shower the Zoko. Then you jump up something, okay? That's something like no, then you care about, then you teach our Zoko. The consumption of some killer, then you develop it. Ta, Tondam Shanship Sama Kenny, okay, that cannot there are no us. Okay, you who do not you can go das. There are no go sustain. Canato don't be day, there are no good quarrel. Here, the tablet, Tam can take here. Okay, then you Tasi, your day, there are no good center. There are Tani, then you reap on Katog of a centigram, kind mind. Or a chickana make the tasso come chet on Tarvachi. Sent erosion, Zampo, Chichikanam, Toy, the captain. Contact Dona Gary News on Tona Mantona Dan. Niluke, you know, here of Tani, Gon Yesua. Gary Yesuna, Gary Harsuna, or Dino, then he patot something. Young, then he did that and hot something chini. They want to share little Zoku, Hakozoa. Or a team meet to shower the Zoku, here getting all at that shower. Semola that shower, a Zoku, the catching, or 20 days. There the consumption to Senkel Latini, Malcolm Chance of Senkel Latini, Yan Zena de Kyo, the Channel, Ted of Shondaure, Tamatsu Tet of Shina de Kyo. Oh, the deep she lamp to shake of your race.
So, how do we carry happiness onto the path? With the same methods, by relying on relative bodhicitta and on ultimate bodhicitta. Essentially, the idea is that we're never separate from those, and they're perfectly capable of carrying any circumstance onto the path. So then the first thing is we recognize our good fortune, whatever joy or happiness we have. And here we don't have to stop the perception of enjoying or liking it, so it's a little different. We just recognize that we are enjoying something, that we like something. And then the next step is that we want to use. So in general, we need the framework that we're going to use happiness as an opportunity to continue to cultivate the causes for happiness and our positive qualities and potentials. So that's our perspective, is not to waste positive moments, not to waste the pleasure or joys of life, but to actually use them then to continue to train in mind training and to continue to create and further increase well-being and benefit. And so at that moment, when you're experiencing whatever kind of thing it is that you're being happy over, that you're enjoying happiness, then we consider all living beings and how in many different circumstances they lack this or other kinds of happiness and well-being. And then we generate loving kindness, in which we think, then I wish, I want all beings, all of these beings to have this and even greater happiness than this. And then we can make the aspiration, may all beings have this, whatever you could name the happiness, the well-being, good fortune, And then may all beings have this happiness, and may they have even greater happiness than this. And so then we're then generating that wish that others experience happiness. And in many ways, we have, a fair amount of opportunities. When you think of the word happiness, it includes just like joy, pleasure, well-being. So, for instance, then most of us will get at least one good meal a day, or many of us may. And so if you have a nice meal and you're enjoying it, that's happiness, whatever you're enjoying in that moment. And you can do this practice here. Or perhaps maybe you slept well last night, and you wake up and you're feeling pretty good. And so, when we wake up and we've had a good sleep, we kind of have a little bit of like a toss to our head, and maybe we like toss our hair and we're like, and we have our little like happy expression from a good night's sleep, which is not what happens when we didn't sleep last night and we wake up. But whatever it is, you wake up, you feel good, that's happiness. That's pleasure or joy. That's something that you can do practice with. And so any tiny moment of pleasure, joy, happiness, the full spectrum of well-being, starting with the tiniest little things to the middling things to the greater things. At that moment that we're experiencing it, we recognize we're experiencing this good fortune and well-being, whatever it is. And then we think of all beings and how so many of them don't have this. And we can think, I wish, wouldn't it be wonderful if they all had this and even greater happiness? And may they all have this and greater happiness. And just, give yourself a few moments to kind of savor that and complete that thought of both the intention of wanting them to have happiness and then the aspiration of wanting them to have happiness. Give it time to completely form and complete. Don't rush through it and on to the next, but really kind of savor that and let the full thought complete itself. And then just let the mind rest for a moment. Kind of let that sort of settle in you. And then you've completed what we call the practice of carrying happiness onto the path with relative bodhicitta. And then you have the next step is carrying happiness onto the path with ultimate bodhicitta. So at that moment, the happiness, which is basically a pleasant sensation that you're experiencing mentally or physically, at that moment of the sensation, then instead of focusing on the object, turn your attention toward the sensation itself, toward the mind itself, the experiencer, and just turn inward. And the looker, the one that's looking, is wisdom. This is the prajna, the profound insight. It's looking at the essence of the perceiver of, the experiencer of pleasure, joy, happiness, well-being, whatever you want to label it as. And then merely looking, and in looking at that happiness, that sensation, then does it have a shape? Does it have a color? Does it have a location? Just kind of gently observing. And whatever it is that it is experienced in the observance of it, then perhaps you even actually have a genuine, by definition, profound insight in which you experience it free from any referential objects. But whatever it is, whether you directly, that leads you to a direct experience of the natural state of the nature of that mind, or if it, then whatever arises in the looking, whatever is sort of discovered, whatever is experienced at that moment, you merely look at its essence toward itself and then relax. And so merely look at the essence of the happiness and then relax. And let that full action complete itself so that you have the complete sort of action, kind of savor that, allow it to sort of fully sort of arise, where you look at its essence and then you relax and let that complete. And that is letting it, the full action, not rushing through it, is important. It serves a value here. And so then that would be called carrying happiness onto the path using ultimate bodhicitta. And we call it profound insight, even if we don't have a profound insight, because it's the practice for cultivating it. So whatever it is that we see, we may not actually directly experience the nature of the mind and the looking at its essence, but gradually over time it will lead to that, and it is considered a practice of profound insight, even if the insight isn't yet generated. So?
Teni ta Khentrul do samkare. Okay, teni ko namu teni dewa nyong samre yona da. Dorna kauntar kyam katu ina rang la devi te chik chora nyong samre shona lam khershi na chik thona te me do kare je na no mori ne yo. Oya te kon me do ay ma. Teni lam sang kyu dewa kaung ba tem gak do ma re je. Ta chik ta na chu ha ko bo ya chire. So dewa lam khershi ni teni dewa la teni gewa ta pa dewa la teni yontan ta phyo na chu peshut ta phyo when a te korma dewa zuk ro pa na chi yong wi she ki yo ma di cha te ha ko bo chi les teni ta dewa ta dungar te ni ka mai pe chora tam nyum pa chi yo ba when na chon sam ma dewa yo mai dungar yo mai pa nga cho yo re teni semchen ma bo ding on yo dewa ta dungar ka chora ka me pi ngona duk yo kan yo the kari pichari jana the mo ba mar pichari di shena na rani ti wa to so yo na ya ti ni kabla tenis semchen der ta utani nyumo ba mo ba teni mari pi no duk yo kan semchen tamche te ta odi teni suyo semchen tamche te ta mari pari tharwar kirchi mari pari thar so na chima samya on deli ko teni nyoje che mo bo oya te ta utani nyoje che mo gum o ta tangi lawa te kontuk shangchuk sem ke dewa lam khir zate chobo teni shambare ta shambare dewa tam dan do shambare wa cho shambare go ni lam khir she ki yo te ta shi de go is
and a gao can long care so compassion shwa
yeah o teni shi na de go teni ta da ni la pro pa de mari pa nyumu pa tham chet garkel lam ki deep she na ne te ta go go nyang che ko teni ti jila kontok shangchuk sem ki soro tangyum du yo kan soro ti rom jin la ta na dik yo te shi na teni te shi ni tondam shangchuk sem ki shirep go ni te lam chir shi ni ti ni ru la nyam ship shi ni o te shi te ta u che ko yo te di shi lam chir che ko es oya ta ti go ni chir te lam te cher sur ni chas teni ta gar sha ke yin ze na ne te ta u chir te lam te cher sur pa yun tam ju ni no chi che
So when we're practicing with happiness, like positive circumstances, then primarily the relative bodhicitta is focusing on the loving kindness aspect, which is the wish that others find happiness. Whereas when we're suffering, and that's what we're aware of, then we do the compassion, the wish that others be free from suffering. So there's slightly different aspects of the relative bodhicitta that are focused on, depending on the circumstance. So then, in this way, like anytime you have any kind of well-being, if even you just feel a little bit good one morning, like anything like that, you can practice like this, you can carry everything onto the path. And you might wonder, well, does that mean it will make it go away? Don't worry. Doing a little practice there and cultivating even more awareness of what's positive in that experience is not going to end the experience faster. So it's more like going to enhance the experience. So that is, also slightly different from how it is when we are dealing with adversity and mental afflictions. So that's how we carry happiness onto the path. And then that means that all the positive circumstances too are being made into something positive, are being used to cultivate something meaningful and not wasted and not something that we get lost to. And so that's just a little bit about carrying happiness onto the path. So what about when it's not positive or negative? We're not having happiness or unhappiness. We're neutral. We don't really feel anything. Could be a blank state, could be just not, you're just walking around, you see people and you have no positive or negative feeling. There's just nothing in particular strong either way, it's neutral. Well, neutrality is actually a sort of sub. First, you have to recognize that. So that's again, we're developing the habit to be aware of our experience. Oh yeah, so right now this is neutral. Okay. Then what is neutrality? Neutrality is an aspect of confusion, of a non-recognition of true nature. So in the three poisons of the mind, it is categorized as ignorance. As ignorance. And so basically it's an unknowing or unawareness. It doesn't see or know true nature. So it's categorized as ignorance. And so for this, that would be a compassion practice. So then when we recognize, okay, this is neutrality, then we would think, I wish or I want all beings to be free from ignorance in entirety. And the aspiration, may all beings be free from ignorance. And in this way, we're meditating on great compassion, because ignorance is a non-recognition of true nature. It might just be blank, it might just be neutral, but it's a component of that non-recognition. It is, therefore, a disturbing emotion and also an impediment or an obstacle to our well-being and the source of suffering. And therefore, considering how other beings suffer because of the presence of ignorance, because of the presence of unawareness and unknowing, then we can generate compassion for them. And so we would do the relative bodhicitta of generating great compassion. And then we would do the ultimate bodhicitta, the profound insight, in which then the next step would be to look at the essence of the neutrality. And merely look at its essence and then rest, let go and rest. And so that's how we would carry neutrality onto the path. And so that kind of completes how we carry the full spectrum of all of our experiences onto the path, how we use them for practice. And now Rinpoche said I want to speak a little bit about the beneficial effects and qualities and the results of doing so. Masam?
Oh yeah, Teni Ta Telane Gondu Shapin Lam to Kirshaka Ken Zango Ken Nambat Ni Ken Zangan Kana might be Tanyumba. There's something. Yamana Tora Deva Dunga Tanyum some Zena. There that was Chatante Lam to Kirshak, Lam to Kirna. Garib Sheki Ore Zenane, Kunzop Shanchum Semket, Tondum Shanchum Semki, Tabap Teni Lam the Kerna, Di Teni Tap Shirap Down, Nyorjenika, Tap Zamo in Jimsenki, Ken Namba Teta Tamshet down, Troxen Chario, Ken Namba Teta Tamshet down, Giva get to the take over. Then I took two guess as you when you join it, Teni, Pay, Ken Namba Teta Tamshet, Garib Shonsona. Don't me pattern, Nyawo me pattern, Drew me pattern, which you mind pattern. Don't yopa, Nyawo yopa, Dungar Shonaya, Shon Coach pattern, which Zenayanga, Dungar Shonaya, Yako in Batao, Jangan Chana, Yako in Biranjin, Jet to Panto Jachimbo in Biranjin Center, Jet to Hill, but Tesh is. Deva Gento, Deva Yunai, Deva Lam Chertipshi, Deva, the Nikora, given it to Jet to Hill. Oh yeah, Tangyum, Sora Tangyum, but that's why in Nayam, then you tell it, I will get to give it on to get here. Gary in a tap zone, tap on ship, Kenyam Nikala, Tenni, Teni, Lam to Chesha Day, gave it on the Janto, Girsha, gave it on the Janto, get to Girshe, Tap Tigoni, Gerhio, Jirkanta, Gansaka, not to Yamlin Tigoni, Yamsalinkam, Gansaka. There are she not on Yamlim Kanam, Tita Sheffield. The during Dutella, test out the Kosan Tata, and gave it to Shumatan. Kale Mumto, Kale Kaleshini, not to Luton Semla Shipde, Chairman Yopatan. There gentle Tatuxona, Maopana, Sem to Shipde, Chatan Chigleb Yopatan, Semnam beyond Chatan Chikaran Yopa, Tonio Yopate. Mao Banan Denyu Yopate, D to the Lam Tipsipala, Teni, Yongyo. 디 겸생기 마우바나 셈남염 가성 로종고 파임샤스와 디니 감납샤 파타토는 예대 바지 견토된 나초 이기 대와테 조이 비셔나 셈기나라 탐시 니 탐시도 대위 쪽순차라 대와니 더 하리오나 간섬치나 루나와 고르니 대니 저거 왕보 탐치라 그존 중화 루나와 너나 강타정 루나와 지 중나야 셈기 대와데 똑치보이 비겸선기 zirkinan ko nyung mata pa hama ko kare tina sem dewa to kamni tam lo yung khang dum diuri o de kale yari yung gri o ya teni shini nga chu lo yung she tang de nyam nem she chut de ta u shini lo bu yo res
So what is it that we are bringing onto the path? Positive circumstances, negative circumstances, and neutral circumstances. The sensations of pleasure, pain, and neutrality. All of these, which pretty much cover the full spectrum of our experience, is what we are bringing onto the path, what we're transforming into the path and practice. What is the agent that transforms? It's ultimate bodhicitta, the profound wisdom, and relative bodhicitta, the great compassion. These are our methods. And great compassion and profound wisdom, these methods are able to transform all circumstances into positive ones. For example, if we cultivate these and are able to do this in the face of adversity, then now the adversity is arising as our friend. The adverse conditions become our companions to what? To cultivating positive circumstances. And that is actually very inspiring, to think that we could relate to all adversity as our friend, as a companion to our spiritual practice and growth. Then none of it is meaningless. It's not like meaningless suffering or difficulties. We're making it meaningful. We're cultivating something that has a positive effect in the present and will also have positive results in the future. It isn't without a positive future result. And so then, even though suffering may be occurring, we're using it for something positive that both improves and benefits us in the immediate circumstance, but the long-term circumstance then is that we eventually overcome the adversity and we create the causes for future, temporary, and ultimate well-being. We can completely, there isn't any circumstance that we can't transform, that we can't begin to change with sufficient power and experience in the practice. And so then those are the kind of benefits of working with adversity, transforming adversity in the path. And then likewise, carrying happiness onto the path is the same. It means we're using happiness to create positive conditions, positive causes for future happiness. So we're using happiness as well. We're creating happiness. And then we use neutral circumstances in the same way for creating happiness. And so then that means all circumstances become a source of something positive for us. Be they first initially arise as adversity, as happiness, or as neutrality. Because we're bringing them, we use all of them with the most excellent methods that we possibly could for the best potential outcome, which is for cultivating great compassion, skillful means, and wisdom, for cultivating what is positive and meaningful, And so we're transforming everything. What is the agent that transforms everything? It's the practice. Who is transforming everything? You are transforming everything. You, the practitioner of that, the one who is implementing that. And so the immediate effect of that is that even right now, we begin to see a benefit and purpose. And all of those three experiences are made more positive. And then as we continue to persist in that, then that becomes more and more positive. We continue to create more and more positive conditions that bring a greater and greater physical and mental well-being, peace of mind, and happiness. Ultimately resulting in finding genuine and ultimate peace and well-being and happiness within ourselves, and uncovering and revealing all of our mind's positive qualities and potentials. And that's what it brings forth in the future. That's going to be brought out of us through this practice. And that is the reason in the training that one of the measures of mind training in the 5th key point is that a measure that we know that we're doing mind training when we continuously have a joyful frame of mind. Where there's a point that no matter what occurs, there's a genuine joy and well-being within us, no matter what the circumstances are. Because everything that arises is the companion to further our engaging in and creating the causes for happiness. And that has so many different ways in which it affects our experience, and physically as well. Eventually, even if our body is sick, then, or we have damage to any of our 5 sense faculties and so forth, because of the power of the well-being of mind, the strength, the power of the well-being of mind will overwhelm and pretty much sort of counteract the suffering that is arising so that we don't even feel it. So we could have a sickness but not feel pain. And so all of this is possible through continued perseverance in mind training. If we do that over time.
Maybe you think maybe that's impossible. Have lots of happiness in the mind, then you cannot feel your physical sufferings and the sickness. You think that, yeah? But yes, because one example, I give you the reason. One example, because when you have huge, you having big sufferings, then you cannot feel small happinesses. And your mind very, very having very large sufferings. Even you have a very, very good pillow. If you just sleeping, you cannot feel it.
You don't enjoy it.
You do not enjoy it. Somewhere.
And so Rinpoche said, slowly, if you continue constantly to do this, day by day, gradually building the strength of mind and the strength of the practice, then those results are available to all of you. And so that is what comes from the mind training. Lesson?
Oh yeah, that. Teni katsong tawatang jeni. Tam jula kachin mo chuji ayo. Kare de zenangin dino katsong kerang zongi dungar watang. Teni ken namba kang shong sona. Ken namba de to tamchala teni de mergavi dohi. Fangores, mergavi sambate torko gres. Diwachak tiani yang to kongkores, zopa sheko hiores, and atu zoku no don kitere, dungar taling ki zopa zede, ngatu control malangwata, dungar mepata, sem mantu pirao ji shekores, kartangi tampo taksha swan dungar taling ki zopi kabla, yena yang tani ona marja pe kwenan zambu la murchik hali pe no pa ma po shenkan tam. 대비도 되니 잠부랑라 쇼파 마랍신칸 마보요라 나초랑 소소라 노밥신칸 당잔라 노밥신칸 마보요라 원나 대덕 탐치기 토라 컨트롤하나 컨트롤랑 그래야 요리지 답실당 직된 그 급시하죠 나초 되니 토모만 비 샘기 로브용 신칸가 강서당 너비랑라이나 가리 얘기는 되니 컨트롤 좀 맞도 뭐 컨트롤 요때 요 같이 용고 말 오야 잔라 노파데 강요요 말 강스타 격더니 잔라 먼체와데 나와상기 비 추도 나와상기 비 람 되니 딥셔나가투 샘기고니 잔기 독도 컨트롤하야 요말 하고스와 되니 가리레제나는 컨트롤하나 판도용 요말 강요 옛날에 되니 샘기고니 컨트롤 말랑 왔다 샘기고니 janki tokto teni chi ngansam damada tedi chi khot chi jamba ti no pa shen khang ka kansa tela ngamba chi chong song na gawa gumya tang tela chi chong song ngamba chi yuna samya de ma yu go byon na la yore ti ti yan la duk ma chans teni kare jina rangni de chi chungwi cheto sem dewo chip chung cheto jan la nyam sona mapsam ta ma ong la yori so de nam shin shi ni sem ki toni jan ki tok to sama ngam ba so ayo ma yenna ya yorwi go ni ka kap go kare na ka kap che tap yo na che na ya ko yo kwa na mo jan ki no la no pa shi na rang go ka to ka ko okay then chum su che na che ko kwa go yo tenin zambu lang la su no pa shekyo na gyar khap lang no pa yung kyo na teni hwam no chut hwam chut tham chel lang no pa shong kyo na teni khoryu no pa shekyo na teso ka thap yo na ra ko shopa ka goni shekyo kyo re ha ko swa o te ta we ze ta chik o ya ti goni ta chik saba gewa goni shopa haro bote teni no pa te ta tham chel chop thap she ya de action kya ka ni kyo shopa goni 대타우 삼모 땅고 되니 파로 모델랑 컨트롤 몰랑위 탑 요르웨 제네 요리 더 가르레 나 치나 카르성 주파나 제 컨트롤 나수 라나 소수 고니 남캡셔야 즉 다로 잠비 컨트롤 라이르 고모 랍삼모 땅 요레 잠바 코르 머둑샤 이바당 코르 샤와 남바 셴카 임바 뎀바 인트그레 뎀바 고니 인트그레 대타우다 옛나야 간스티 쫀라 머타 나위 루라 가리요레세나 간서티 샘크 juk nyumu bikyonla ta seji ta te sammo tango kyores ti juk nyumu bikyonla ta go seji 간서 비kyonla 간서라 martavar nyumu bi kare jena pharo bode nyumu bi want no we nyumu bi want sona janlang no pa lushit janlang no pa shet pa mazak rong kroni yang so par che kyorwa tanjam no la tame parwa rong krong la no pa che kyo pate the nyumu bi want to song ni sen want ra want gir ma thap parne teni ma bo shong ko te tar to shi ni o ganzak ni kyun re ma sam ba chi ni o ganzak to gyuk nyumu bi kyun re sam kwe na nyima re la kera marga sa ka ganzak chi tak par yo na ne cho ga ga me na teni ganzak ti kyun la mar sa ku gyuk nyumu bi kyun re sam teni khon de ta wu nyumu pa li tras na chema ro tar bar kirchi sam ni sabab sa o te ta to nyang chi kum na ya ko janki thok to lor tang te ri yin na jorwa ko goni pharo ku jorwa kari chi na tab ka ko yore ma chu jori goni kan tab tab che ko wallan te res
So then there was a question yesterday that is a really important point. It ties into all these teachings and that I wanted to also address here towards the end of these teachings. And the question was, when looking at the adversity of seeing someone, then, okay, so in general, no matter what adversity it is, no matter what the reason for that suffering and adversity, the perspective of mind training is to relinquish our dislike and cultivate a patient forbearance of not being disturbed by it. And that then is the basis of our practice. And there is no circumstance in which there is an exception to doing practice in this way, in which then we justify, for example, anger. So it could be an adversity in which someone is validly causing harm. It's not just our mental projection. There's truly someone causing an enormous amount of harm in the world. It's obvious they're harming others due to their actions and so forth. They're just causing an enormous amount of harm. So the question is there any such thing as righteous anger? Can we justify the anger? And I understand that from a worldly perspective, people consider that there are circumstances where anger is justified. However, from a practice perspective, there is never a reason where anger is justified. From the mind training perspective, is not a worldly perspective. It is not a conventional ordinary way of thinking that we're cultivating to continue to perpetuate our ordinary experience. We're cultivating an extraordinary perception of mind training. And that means there is no condition that falls outside of the spectrum where then we can say anger is justified. Because no matter what, from this perspective, anger itself is a source of harm. And having it ourselves is harmful. So we're just justifying being harmed. So, when we look at the Buddhist path, it is called the peaceful path of harmlessness. And in that, we are relinquishing the causes of suffering, one of which is anger. And so there is no justification for it because it will only perpetuate suffering, ourselves or others. It does not benefit us. But that does not mean that we cannot take action. Actions, the same actions, can be done without anger. And so we recognize that anger is a disturbing emotion. If we have it, we're suffering under it, and we're going to engage in actions. It does not benefit. Being angry alone doesn't change the circumstance, it doesn't change the past, it only causes harm. So the way that we approach this kind of situation is that we still do the mind training, relinquish the dislike. We have to get over it and let go of our categorical unhappiness and disturbed mind over the circumstance. But that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge that those actions of another individual are not okay. It just means that we're not feeding our mental disturbances and suffering over it. And so we apply the mind trainings and we can cultivate a well-being, even in the face of that. We don't have to lose our well-being because of that, but we are able to take action from a positive mindset. So while we still want to continue to not perpetuate the suffering, the anger and justification of our mental affliction by recognizing how that harms us and others, it doesn't mean we don't take action. So when you get angry, then and you keep getting angry and keep getting angry, you're upset about something, then that actually disempowers you. Eventually it causes you to be ineffective in ever overcoming that circumstance. It makes you weak. And so it will cause you to have no effectiveness. It brings like a lack of power and sort of agency. And so then we're ineffective in actually able to surmount that and find freedom from that adversity. For example,
머니가 걔랑 조보던 걔랑 얘기 직통나
So if there's two people, like you and your friend, and you're talking, and maybe you have an issue with each other.
Okay,
So there's a little issue, and you're speaking. And then if you get angry, and then you're in that emotion and talking, usually you can't give a very good answer.
Okay.
Then your effectiveness will be less. If the other is able to, and then, there's these issues that you guys are discussing. No, the other. And then your companion. Okay, if your companion is disturbed and angry and really upset and trying to give a response to you, and your mind relaxes.
Okay, relaxes and
really spacious and open. Your response and how you answer them is going to be. You can still give a very good response. More likely a better one. Or maybe there is no response.
Okay.
And that's the appropriate action. But if you get angry, then the anger itself, that's just a mistake. There's no excuse. There's no point where the anger is beneficial.
Yes.
So we can take effective action without anger. And that's the point to understand, that the anger is harmful. And that effective action is not stopped just because our mind is not disturbed. In fact, our effectiveness and power grows. So when we see injustices in the world, when we see people causing a lot of harm, whether it's between countries, whether it's someone doing something that undermines the economy of everyone's economic capacities, whether it's the environment, whatever it is, we don't have to be upset to take extremely effective action. Therefore, action is not being denied in mind training. Mental afflictions are what we're subduing, but the action, we should take action. Take action to benefit. If there is an action you can take to prevent harm, you should engage in that action. But you can engage in that action without anger, without affliction, and then your actions are much more powerful. And then they're also positive, because your intent is positive, and then you're carrying that out in an effective way. And so then it's important to understand that doing the mind training and addressing the emotions, not becoming angry and so forth, does not prevent good actions. And it actually supports good actions without the harm of being upset and all that entails. And so, yes, there are circumstances where it's not just our perception or projection, but somebody is truly causing an enormous amount of harm in the world, and actions are necessary. But at the same time as taking actions, the way that we view them can be from a compassionate perspective. And so in the mind trainings, there's actually a whole section of how to generate compassion for that individual, the harm doer. And that is then very kind of succinctly put here, is that we recognize that each living being takes actions due to the state of their mind. And to engage in harm, especially on a big scale, that individual has to be experiencing an enormous amount of mental afflictions. They are tortured by their thoughts. They are enduring extremely negative thoughts and emotions. And only under that level of duress could someone engage in some of the kinds of actions that people do. They are completely under the control of disturbing emotions. They have no power and no agency. Their mind is actually weak and insecure. And it's completely under the power of those afflictions. And then not only are they suffering as a result of those afflictions, but they're creating the causes for a lot of future suffering and unhappiness. And so it's, whether we look at it now or down the road, they're under the power of other, meaning of the disturbing emotions. They don't have agency. And that is creating all of the suffering for themselves and others. And so then that is the process of mind training, is not just looking at the individual in general and blaming the individual, but actually looking at the source of where their harmful actions are coming from, blaming the disturbing emotions, the flaws that are present in their mind, seeing what that's creating in them and their actions, and thereby feeling great compassion. And so it's the compassionate wish, then we can generate the mind training and thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful? I want them to be free from those disturbing emotions. And may they find freedom from those disturbing emotions. And so in this way, we do the mind training out of great compassion. And it's completely possible thereby to not be angry, to have patient forbearance, to generate compassion toward them, and then to take action to stop those harmful actions. And therefore, from the perspective of mind training, there is no justification for anger.
Teni ta pache almost time. It's teni karlavia yenzena sarshet tsirchim.
Okay.
Dino nangi action sem mendrupigo ni sem zampo ko ni action che gore se ke ba. Teni sem teni che gore se te janla so go gore mem ta ker gore maktuk jam gore se kyo mara. Te kero to ha ko gore. Teni kamma jap gore se atang o te so merge bi shok she gore se te ngi se kyo mata na bi na yo mara. Te jambi teni te contact of China, when now peaceful protesting there, Zambulang Tola, Benuba Chambodua, or De Notion down terms of Shea Lasso Patang, or De Susho Nina de, then he did number not so far of the contact. Does it?
So one important point though, when we say that we can take action. And so the first action is on our mind so that we're not disturbed. And then to take actions in the world out of a kind heart. That, again, in the Buddhist tradition, actions that cause harm to others would not be justified, like killing, like weapons, like stealing. So it doesn't mean take non-virtuous or harmful or negative actions. That, again, would not correspond with the mind training. So this is the sort of peaceful path of harmlessness, which means we find peaceful measures to stop the harm, to stop the suffering. And so it's finding skillful means, whether it means in the courts, peaceful protesting, whatever kinds. There are so many actions that we can take without causing harm. And so again, then we want to remember there's still some basic principles of ethics that we would want to follow when we say take action. Doesn't mean take violent actions.
Thank you.
So that's it. That's the end of the time that we have.
I thought I'm going to leave some questions, but we have no time.